Thank you, Jeremy. When Jeremy introduces you, you always wish he was giving the talk. It's so beautiful. I have to tell you, since he was talking about nature, that I have a nightingale in my garden. I think that's the most important thing I probably have to say. But I'll keep trying. Okay, the return of Gaia. So why are we even talking of the return of Gaia? Probably because, or sadly because, it came up in a scientific context with James Lovelock, who was looking for a name for his theory that the Earth was a self-regulating system and had homeostasis, which he then went for a walk out of nowhere with his neighbour, William Golding, who wrote Lord of the Flies, and was also a classicist. And when he said, "Oh God, what will I call this?" Golding said, "Well, Gaia, of course." And the Gaia hypothesis was born, seemingly out of nowhere. But how interesting is that? And then the notion of Gaia, Gaia herself, seemed to come alive, and you hear it everywhere now. Gaia is somehow substantiated. It is a home. It's something and someone that she never used to be. And this was not what Lovelock had intended. It was as though the very notion of a self-regulating Earth, an Earth with a soul, an Earth with purpose and intelligence like us, was an image we had all been waiting for, ever since perhaps we saw the Earth from the moon only 10 years before. Lovelock was the late 70s. The Earth was 68, 63. So it was almost like Gaia was giving a home for the imagination. Home is where you start from, says T.S. Eliot. And it took off almost on its own in the way that we usually wonder how that could be. Is it the collective unconscious? What is fueling it? Where is it going next? What does it have to tell us, basically, since it must come from a very deep region of our being that we aren't fully aware of. So, Einstein insisted that if we do not begin with the universe, begin with the whole, we can't see anything clearly. Well, the part, as he put it, will be off. And so here, for the first time, we see our Earth as a whole, as we all know, but we also see the sheer isolation of our Earth. And we see the Earth as we used to see the moon, looking rather the same, the moon that we fell in love with. And it may be that it helped us to fall in love with the Earth again as a whole, and to see that the Earth has consciousness, like us. It's not a background, as Jeremy was saying, that we live off, a resource to be plundered. It, or rather she, in the image of Gaia, is a subject in her own right, and we don't understand her well, and we don't treat her well. And why has she come? Whatever the passions of man have gathered about becomes a symbol in the great memory, which is the memory of nature herself. That's Yeats. And an image that has transcended place and time, and as it were, gone beyond death, says Yeats, becomes a symbol and becomes a living soul. Such a wonderful image. So Gaia is our living soul. She comes back almost unbidden, almost supposedly at random, and yet, of course, nothing is at random, even at the best of times, but especially when it catches the consciousness of the zeitgeist. So therefore, we have to go back to the original Gaia, if she is a living soul, and understand what Gaia means, who she was, how is she now. Now, so therefore, we're going back, right, to the original Gaia. Now that actually is not Gaia, but I'll just put it up while I'm talking because she's so amazing. She's the goddess of Lucelle, 20,000 BC, if anyone doesn't know her, with a bison's horn in her hand, with the 14 notches of the crescent moon, her pregnant belly in her other hand, and her head inclining to the bison's horn. So she is saying, as above, so below. She lies at the top of a landscape in the rock shelter in Lucelle. She's absolutely amazing, and she was surrounded with animals, little animals looking like her. Now, why I brought her in is that Gaia comes out of a tradition, a great, I always bring her in, but this is my excuses. There's a great tradition of images and feeling for Earth as a living reality. She is Earth. She would be Gaia if they called her Gaia. And there was a goddess culture that extended in Paleolithic times, 20,000 BC, all the way from Siberia, and all over the world, really. So we're going just back a little bit, just to see where Gaia comes out of, our Greek Gaia, ancient Greek Gaia, 700, 800 BC. Now this is 20,000 BC. Now, there's Lascaux, 15,000 BC. We've lost 5,000 years in that quick click. And here is this wonderful horse, one of many, I'm sure you've seen them everywhere, all over the cave, with a branch over her pregnant belly. The branch itself is flowering. Now, of course, with our 20th century consciousness, when we went back to it, the scientists thought that it was a way of shooting the horse in advance so that it wouldn't be so awful when you did it in fact. But then when they got carbon dating, they saw that it was a flowering branch, and actually it was a symbol, as is the whole of Lascaux. So that tells us that we vastly underestimate original consciousness, and that if we go back with our own oppositional fallacies, then we aren't going to see it right. We have to unthink what we know. Now we come to Minoan Crete, with the two serpents of life and death brought forth from the goddess. And now we come to the Mycenaean fusion with Minoan Crete, still from Knossos, one of which is, you see the little goddess coming up from the ground, and you see the larger mother goddess by the tree, and you see death on the left with skulls, and what you're seeing, and you see the sun and moon united at the top. What you're seeing is the origin of Persephone coming up from the underworld, the shoots coming up from the underworld to be reconciled with their mother as spring. So this is 1500 BC. So this is how they were thinking. Now, the Olympian, the point about Gaia is comes from one of four creation myths. And we're about 800 BC now. That's 1500 BC. So we've had 700 years in the middle, at least, and many people from Minoan cultures came to Greece. Many of these people came because of the earthquakes and the tsunamis and goodness knows what. So that you're talking about a really old tradition. Now this old tradition then met the Achaean, who spoke Greek, who were the Indo-European invading tribes, actually, but they weren't as bad as other invading tribes. And they arrived in Greece in the 8th century BC. And interestingly enough, they gave Gaia her resonant name from the Indo-European language. So Gaia's Indo-European, which they brought with them. And in India, the Gayatri mantra was the first to come out of the Om, the original sound, and was itself and herself both a sound and a goddess and humanity. In a culture where sound and meaning were the same, sound was the meaning. So Gaia may resonate in ways that we have no notion of today, but it came from 2000 roughly BC. And Gaia was also the name of the place where the Buddha received enlightenment, as though this were the supreme human achievement, the right relationship with Earth. So this fusion allowed a very distinctive voice to appear, which we now have. Gaia, 3rd century BC from Crete. The poet Hesiod, writing in 700 BC, he was the first to dramatize the process of creation in his poem Theogony, the genealogy of the gods. Gaia was the first to arise from chaos, which didn't mean disorder in Greek, it meant formlessness. And so the origin of cosmos, literally an ordering, a harmonious whole. She embodies then the original moment of wonder that made sense of the world, and so laid the foundation on which the mind could rest. Who else could she be but mother of all, the one who gives birth to all the forms that are to come? Once she is present, she gives birth to heaven. Then Gaia bore starry heaven, first to be an equal to herself, to cover her all over, and to be a resting place always secure for all the blessed gods. Then she brought forth long hills, and the barren sea with its swollen waves, and then she lay with heaven. So she transforms her son Uranus, heaven, into her lover in the widespread tradition of sun lovers of the goddess, who brings forth all from herself and then unites with them to create the forms of nature. And they give birth together to the next generation of divinities called the Titans, 6 goddesses and 6 gods, among whom were Themis, law, Mnemosyne, memory, Rhea, the flowing one, and Chronos, time. So Gaia was an image or an idea far beyond what Earth has become for us today. She was inherently lawful, that's Themis, because all these names of goddesses are, of course, attributes, they're modes of being, carrying the memory of the whole. Mnemosyne, great memory. Rhea, whose name means the flowing one, the life force. Can't step in the same river twice, says Heraclitus. Pantarai, everything flows. Embodying the changing rhythms of time. Chronos, chronometer, which we get in all these words, they live in our language now. It followed that lawfulness, memory, the flow of life and temporal rhythm, as well as all the others, belong to all creation. So, as we follow the story of Gaia unfolding into creation, it's remarkable that in the imagination of the ancient Greeks, Gaia was a dynamic force at every stage of creation. So Lovelock's self-regulating system, which seems so modern and accords with Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, was already there in the imagination of the Greeks. Gaia regulates the ongoing process of life whenever it is arrested. And as a creation myth, it's trying to get it all out there, and it has its stops and goes. Now, inevitably, the stages of the Earth's procreation as imagined by humans are also, or even primarily, the stages of differentiation of human consciousness. Yet it is a consciousness closer to the source of the archetypal reality, and therefore closer than ourselves. So in that sense, we may be listening to a wisdom we've lost touch with. So in the next stage of the story, interestingly enough, there's a hiatus, and creation stops when violence and ugliness come into the world. The human problem, what do we do when it goes wrong? And this offends Uranus of heaven. 3 huge, violent, ugly giants are born, with 50 heads and 100 arms. So Uranus pushes the giants back inside Gaia's womb, like, no, we won't have them, which stretches and strains her, and she groans mightily. So she has a plan. She brings forth grey iron from her body and forms a sickle with great teeth. And Kronos, time, takes up the challenge and harvests his father's genitals, as the Greek has it, and the bloody drops fall into Gaia's womb and bring forth the Furies, guardians of ethical law, images of conscience. This is often known as the separation of the world parents, and it happens all over the world. It's obviously a stage which has to be overcome in the imagination. But Greece has the severed genitals of Uranus falling into the lap of the sea and bringing forth foam-born Aphrodite, the meaning of her name, goddess of relationship and love. Not just human love, the love of heaven for earth, the moist espousals of rain, as Aeschylus calls them. So she's then the first fruit of the separation of heaven and earth, the only goddess to carry within herself the memory of the whole. Picture. Yes, there she is being drawn out of the waves, as she was each spring when she was renewed, all the goddesses were renewed by being bathed like Aphrodite in spring. See, they lived in a sacred universe, and they're goddesses and gods that they imaged and they carved and made of stone. They treated them like the Egyptians did, as living beings, and they honored them, and through them they honored all creation. So at this point I have to paraphrase a little bit, or as you can see, we'll be here forever. So at this point, Gaia saves, the next stage of this creation is Gaia saves Zeus from the Titan Kronos, who wants to rule forever. So he swallows his offspring as soon as they're born. And Gaia gives his wife, Rhea, a stone for him to swallow instead of the last child, who was Zeus, and he disgorges all the 6 children he's already swallowed. Then Zeus fights the Titans. What's she doing there? Well, we'll go back to her. Zeus fights the Titans, and Gaia draws thunder and lightning out of her belly to help him. But then Zeus, like Uranus, imprisons them in the underworld. Notice the beginning of an oppositional relationship. And Gaia won't have this, which is really interesting. So she doesn't exclude any aspect of life. And so she fights Zeus and loses. Zeus, of course, being the Achaean who's planning to end up as chief god in any case. But this is interesting. This is how he does it. So then Zeus takes over. So there's Zeus. He was in his temple at Dodona. His first prophecies were made through the whispering of oak leaves. I've been there. It's absolutely glorious in the middle of a circle of mountains. So it's only gradually that he becomes more king-like and more doctrinaire. In origin, in Indo-European times, his name meant lighting up, the moment of lighting up, like Theos, like that's wonderful, that's a god. That's what they used to say at theatres. But Gaia's never left behind as a static legend of the beginning of things. Aeschylus writes, "Yea, summon Gaia, who brings all things to life, and rears and takes again into her womb." So to summarize, Gaia was the intelligence behind or within creation. She brought time into being and freed it from the eternal round. She was the home for the dead and the container for the imagining of death. Through her granddaughter Demeter, the dead were called Demetrioi, and they went back to their mother's womb for rebirth. She grew as Narcissus with 100 blooms as a snare for Persephone, daughter of Zeus and Demeter. So she would pick the flower and fall into the underworld arms of Hades and come back as spring. so she keeps the cycle of life going. She inaugurated the new rule of diversity and differentiation, which validated Zeus, god of storm, sky and light. And she was the first oracle of prophecy at Delphi, a word which itself meant womb, handing over to her daughter as the Omphalos at Delphi, Themis, who was later replaced in the new hierarchy by Zeus's son from Apollo. So you see that the gods are becoming the centerpiece, but the point is that they always, especially uniquely in Greece really, the new invading Achaeans reunited with the old goddesses of the land. So Zeus marries, as it were, Themis, goddess of law, and Mnemosyne, goddess of memory. So they incorporate the old order, which is perhaps why we get this wonderful synthesis of the tradition of the goddess and the more articulate version of the god. So Gaia continued to be honoured as a living presence whose laws were written into the lives of all creation. It followed that Gaia's law was related to the moral law of human beings, or as we might say, nature and human nature at the deepest level were not separately configured as they have become today. This is the point, really. In other words, the order of earth was for the Greeks a dynamic moral order implicating human life. A legendary way of saying this is to have the first king given and, as it were, crowned by Gaia, which is what we have here. There's a long story to it, but it doesn't much matter. There's a long story to every Greek mythology, so we'll move swiftly on. But anyway, it might stand as a beautiful symbol of our relationship to Earth, one we've forgotten. Now, it followed that Gaia's law could be profoundly disturbed by the unlawful and immoral behaviour of human beings. And perhaps this is why Gaia is so resonant. Sophocles, in Oedipus Rex, draws on an earth intimately related to the moral life of humanity. Oedipus the king is quite content in his unconsciousness until earth suffers. Suddenly, the land of Thebes begins to die. A blight is on the fruitful plants of the earth. A blight is on the cattle in the fields. A blight is on our women, that no children are born to them. It is Gaia's protest which initiates the drama of Oedipus's awakening to what he has done and who he is, though through no fault of his own even, the slaying of his father and the marrying of his mother. Oedipus sent the Delphic oracle of Apollo to reveal the cause, and the oracle, whose first law was know thyself and whose second law was nothing in excess, now defines for all time the meaning of pollution as a human crime against the divine order, the profaning of what is sacred. That's what the word means in Greek. Miasma, from miasma, miano, to stain, a stain on the original cleansing of creation. King Phoebus in plain words commanded us to drive out a pollution from our land, pollution grown ingrained within the land. So when Oedipus discovers that he is himself the pollution and leaves the city, harmony between the human and divine order is restored, and earth comes back to life. So here, what happens to humans happens to earth, and what happens to earth happens to humans. The soul of the one is also the soul of the other, or to put it another way, the human story and the universe story are one and the same. Now this is what Owen Barfield calls original participation. And we take his guidance. He has a wonderful way of seeing the whole stretch of human consciousness because he sees it as continually evolving. And he has 3 special books: Poetic Diction, 1927, History in English Words, 1953, and Sailing the Appearances, 1957, among many others, but I do recommend those 3. Barfield understands the evolution of consciousness as falling into 3 stages. First, original participation, which is an instinctive union with nature, existing from the beginning, as we've seen in 20,000 BC. The second stage, which we are hopefully at the end of, but at any rate still in, is defined as a withdrawal of participation from the world, which then loses its numinosity and is set in opposition to humanity, while nature's numinosity is transferred to the inner life of human beings. At its best, this leaves humans more free to explore the complexities of their inner nature, but at its worst, it allows humans to exploit nature for human ends alone. The third stage he calls final participation, which is for him the challenge of our present time. He defines this as a new kind of participation with nature, not in the old original way, which in any case is impossible, consciousness inevitably moving on, but at a new level, including both the earlier stages, but through the imagination. So this is how he defines original participation in his strict sense. The essence of original participation is that there stands behind the phenomena, and on the other side of them from me, a represented which is of the same nature as me. Whether it is called manna, or by the names of many gods and demons, or God the Father, or God or the spirit world, it is of the same nature as the perceiving self, inasmuch as it is not mechanical or accidental, but psychic and voluntary. Now, the easier way of saying this, which arrives halfway through the book, Saving the Appearances, is that in original participation, the human individual soul and the soul of the world are not separated. The time of original participation was originally identified with the culture of the goddess, where all children of the universe came from her body and were related to each other and to the mother of all. So the world of early people was a thou, not an it. This is the crucial thing. There wasn't such a thing as an it. That would have been sacrilege, as sometimes a thou is today. A presence, both numinous and personal, a subject in communion with other subjects, sharing the same substance, belonging to the same continuum of feeling. You didn't need to have a different mode of cognition to talk about nature than to talk about human nature. They were one continuum of feeling, rising out of deeply lived experience, and in this respect too, poetry of all ages. The Greeks called this way of knowing the world gnosis, one through relationship, in contrast to the later episteme, which was knowledge about something. However, in the infancy of the world, as Shelley says, everyone is a poet, and language itself is poetry. Now we come to the second stage. Broadly in the second stage, the soul of the world lost its numinosity, both in the Judaic tradition and in the Greek, in different ways. And the human soul separated from the soul of the world. But what does this do? And what was numinous is now dead, basically. Earth is left without soul or spirit, an inanimate object to serve human design, dead matter as it was called, forgetting that the word came originally via matrix from mother. But the world is no longer sacred, it's no longer a thou in withdrawal of participation. And you can see that in the evolution of consciousness, humans would have had to withdraw from this intense union with nature. Whether they had to do it so abruptly and so unconsciously, and because of invasions and because of this and that, is another matter. But it is like the stages of growing up. As an Indian said, North American Indian said, "You asked me to plough my mother's bosom? I'm not going to plough my mother. She won't take me back when I'm dead." So there was a freedom that this second stage made possible. But it did it at great expense, and what we want to do is to try and save the freedom and bring it to a new level, and not have the divisive, oppositional categories that it initially needed to have, perhaps. At any one moment when we have to separate, the other does become opposite. But then the hope is that it quickly doesn't. But in the last 2,000 years, it's reified by in various religions and in various dominant tribes, it did not work very well, at least for now. Now, that just to give you the feeling, we'll just do the images quickly, because you can see from the images there's really more almost than ever saying about them. There's the goddess, this is Sumeria. There's the goddess and god beside the tree of life. Serpents of regeneration, like the moon sloughs its skin as the moon has shadow. An image of harmony. Now, in come the Babylonians, and Marduk, the sun, storm god, blows open, puts his storm force into the mouth of Tiamat, who is the goddess here, whose image is the snake, and blows her apart. And with her dead body, he makes heaven, and with the top part, and with the other part, he makes earth. And the humanity comes from the blood of her murdered son-lover. So we have, for the first time, an image of violence, really awful. They revels in it, in the nature of creation. 2000 BC. Joseph Campbell, who's the wonderful mythologist, says that a great whale went up over 2000 BC. The Indo-European tribes from here and there, Syro-Arabian Desert, or the steppes, Asian steppes, nomadic, God-fearing, their images of the divine in the heavens and in storm and in sun, swept through the agricultural communities and caused great turmoil. Now, moving to our own tradition, if we suspend our normal categories, oh God, this is Genesis, it's in the Bible and everything, can we just sort of look at the image and see that here we don't have the god and goddess beside the tree of life, no reason why we should do, but we need to take in the consequences of not having. See what I mean? So there's Adam and Eve, and the serpent who is now the serpent of death, who brings death. Just let's look at the images. Now what does this say about Earth? Eve, the serpent of death, is framed as Eve. Look at the figures. As Luther said, if the serpent had approached Adam, it would have been a different story. However, he didn't. So, then we get sexuality, also under the cloak of sin, Rubens. And then we get beautiful Masaccio, the expulsion from paradise. Now, of course, we could see all this as a myth of the birth of consciousness, when you look upon yourself and you see yourself naked and different. But unfortunately, it is so frequently and permanently, not permanently, but especially in the beginning, taken so literally. So what do we inherit that we should know about? Because we need to know about these things, because they're in us. And what I was meaning to come to later, was Northrop Frye, who's a wonderful literary critic, Canadian literary critic, who wrote a book called The Bible and Literature. And so he looked at the Bible as if it were literature. So he didn't have to not mind what he said. He's a wonderful critic. And what he came up with was this notion of mythological conditioning, that we all know about personal conditioning and even cultural conditioning, but mythological conditioning is another matter. And he says there's whole parts of our instinctive understanding of life that has been given us for 2,000 years. Jung comes in on this as well. He says, you can't just say, well, I don't agree with that any longer, because we have 2,000 years of psychological adaptation within us. Now, what could this mean? And I think we should all be thinking, if we were to bring Gaia back, what does this mean for us? Do we, without realizing it, look for divinity in a transcendent way? Do we see it? Do we look for it as immanent? Because one of the things that the earlier this tradition and the Roman and Christian tradition as well, inherited from it, was to contrast transcendence and immanence. You know what I mean by that? I mean, in other words, that the values transcend life. They are, we go for them. They aren't in us. They aren't immanent in ourselves, immanent in what we see, immanent in all life. They aren't there for the studying. They have to be, as it were, learnt and thought about. So, I just wanted to show you Van Eyck, because he's the only artist I've ever found who completely shows Adam and Eve as tragic figures contemplating their own death, not in a sinful way, but just reflecting upon life and death and themselves. It's just so unusual. Okay, now, let's see where I am, what time it is. This transcendence was inherited by Christianity, especially when the Romans came in, or rather when the Romans came in. I think it wasn't there before. Now here what we've got is, this is 300 AD. Jesus is on the cross. Above him is the crescent moon of rebirth. He's put in the tradition of the dying and resurrected gods, Orpheus and Dionysus. Bacchus is Roman or Greek as well for Dionysus. And this comes from what is known as syncretism. That's to say, people looked for the unity of different ways of thinking. It comes from once Alexandria fell, and once there was a Hellenistic way of thinking, the Greeks and Egyptians and the Jews and everybody who came there, and even the early Romans, delighted in the fact that they didn't have to fight each other's gods, that they didn't have tribal gods any longer. They saw them as the nature of the universe. However, this did not last after Theodosius came in and after the Romans came in. And Barfield is extremely severe upon the Romans when he says that they took over the Greek myths, which you'll know Bacchus is Dionysus, for example. But if we know him as Bacchus from the Roman, we won't have the stories for him, because the stories ended with the Greeks, and the Romans just took them over as ideas. They became more abstract, yet they were still there. But what does that do to the mind? What does it do to immanence? And what does it do to the fact that by the time of Theodosius, 5th century AD, people were told what to think and how to worship their God? And that wasn't there before, and we should notice it. Okay, I just wanted to go very quickly, to show you. Okay, so sexuality for Eve, the second Eve, Mary, who wouldn't be doing that. Mary, Queen of Heaven, when there was a great longing for everybody from people all over the world to raise the status of Mary, and in 1950 she was declared assumed into heaven, body and soul. In 1954 she was declared Queen of Heaven, but was she Queen of Earth? She couldn't be, could she? So she wasn't. And so she sits above the moon, who is classed, since once the moon's light was understood to be, there's a lot going on in those days. This is 450, Anaxagoras. Was discovered to be only reflected sunlight. The moon was classed with the death with Earth. The moon becomes a dragon. We're in oppositional fallacies. Now this is what I wanted to show you. In art, as Yeats says, all art is forgiveness of sins. That forgiveness of sins imagined by Christ. And therefore, art is free imaginatively. And there's Dürer, seeing through the form, seeing it without dualism, without an oppositional paradigm. Back she comes, moon goddess, why not? There she's like Artemis. So back to syncretism, which dissolves the oppositional paradigm. Goddess of the animals, as it were. There she's like Demeter, goddess of the harvest. And I mean, all the love of human beings for their goddess went into Mary. She's still called Notre Dame, like the moon. So it really matters what she is. There she is, mother and child, but look what happens when you open her up. 15th century, a Vierge Ouvrante she's called. She's actually holding the universe. And there's Jesus back on the tree of life, like all the dying and resurrected gods. Wonderful church, San Clemente in Rome. Anybody sees it. There's Jesus trampling in the winepress, trampling his own sacrifice in the grapes. I'm the grapes, ye are the vine. I'm the vine, ye are the branches. And there is Jesus and Mary in what is known as the coronation of the Virgin, but is actually looking more like in the art a sacred marriage, with the sun and moon under their feet, so that the oppositions are all resolved there. Right. Now, I mention that because it seems to me that there is the collective unconscious coming through the art to try and dissolve this harsh, punitive way of seeing life. And what we've got with Gaia, perhaps, is the same groundswell, but with the folk, with the rest of us, those who aren't artists, people who just long for it to be different. But there may be a continuity that we should be looking for. Okay, now, Barfield's real concern is, this is Blake's Newton, I'm sure you know, may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep, the binary world of compasses. He doesn't see the beautiful seaful rock coming behind him. Reason is the ratio of what is already known. He's scratched over himself, now he can't create anything new. Now, who does that remind us of? The age of reason in the 18th century. So there was a further shift in the center of gravity of consciousness, from the cosmos around us into ourselves as human beings. We can see it in words that express something new. For instance, John Locke in 1634 adopts the new word already coined, consciousness, and defines it as perception of what passes in a man's own mind, reversing an entire way of thinking before him, which put the universe first, as we saw in original participation, and giving self-consciousness its modern meaning. That was before Descartes in 1644 with his cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So since Descartes, philosophy has typically worked outwards from the individual thinking self, rather than inwards from the cosmos to the soul. So the results are twofold. On the one hand, the peculiar freedom of mankind, this is Barfield, spontaneous impulses which control human behavior and destiny, are felt to arise more and more from within the individual. On the other, the spiritual life and activity felt to be immanent in the world outside, in star and plant, in herb and animal, in the juices and humours of the body, grow feebler. But what he thinks it's most difficult for us to get is the fact that we instinctively start with the inner self. We start with ourselves. It's almost hard to imagine not. Start with ourselves and go outwards. But we obviously don't need to do it as heavily as we do it, that's to say. So the distinction between myself and all other selves, the antithesis between myself, the observer, and the external world, the observed, objective, made an object, right, is such an obvious and early fact of experience to every one of us, such a fundamental starting point of our life as conscious beings, that it really requires a sort of training of the imagination to be able to conceive of any different kind of consciousness. And that's one of the things we have to bear in mind. We can't talk of Gaia returning until we've actually felt through the language that we use and the perceptions that we prioritize, and that especially any time that we speak in oppositional paradigms, or we put the individual before the cosmos, or we don't have compassion. Imagination is compassion, because we can feel into the reality of the other, whatever the other is. This is not what we find in the normal 18th century. And the conception of laws governing this world grows more and more impersonal. Matters are described objectively, disinterestedly. And all this time, the European ego appears to be engaged unawares in disentangling itself from its environment, becoming less and less of the actor, more and more of the author and spectator. However, this brings out the best of his wit, which I must tell you, where he allows himself to say, after a really sort of heavy trip, that the meaning of life is continually being dried up, as it were, and left for dead in the human mind by the operation of a purely discursive intellectual activity, which is inseparable from human self-consciousness. So you can see where he's coming from, while also saying, no, we don't want to undo this phase, but we have to go beyond it. And the way we go beyond it is through imagination. But what we have to say to ourselves is that dualism, subject, objective, subjective, is fundamental neither psychologically, historically, nor philosophically. It's simply a stage in our thinking, a necessary one, but it's not inherent in the nature of things. And the trouble is that almost everywhere you look, you read those terms, as though they were inherent. But as soon as you get deeper into anything, as soon as you imagine, imagination seeks for holes, you realize they're not. They're just mostly in the way, but sometimes they're helpful. But if you're creating anything, they're in the way, whether we're painting or writing a poem or wishing to see a sunset. And those are the perceptions that we need to focus on, because these are the ones that are going, that's all we've got really, to go beyond the oppositional comfort really, me and them and this and that, and we know where we are, and you're safe, and don't come near me. It's quite different. You're much more exposed. It's radical. You're out there. You have to make it work yourself in the other way. So we're going away from collective thinking entirely. So, okay, we'll go without all that. Now, basically, what we're trying to do is to go beyond anthropocentrism, putting humans, anthropos, first, and an oppositional paradigm that treats Earth as a resource that does not feel for Earth as consciousness. So whenever we have that language coming to us, or wherever we hear it, or wherever an animal is called it, and not he or she or they, we have to refuse it, because it gets in our way, and it's so easy to refuse. Who ever called their own person, animal they live with, an it? Well, just because we don't live with all of them, it doesn't mean that they suddenly become its. So we have to stand for this. It just has to be not tolerated. Interesting enough, when I was doing the goddess book with my friend Dan Baring, we put all the animals into who, naturally, and when the script came back, they were all made to it, which, that, and they, etc. So when I rang up and said, well, I'm afraid this can't be, it has to be, it's in the grammar. It's the grammar that does this, we can't possibly change it. Can you imagine? So I said, well, we can't possibly do the book then. So then there was a slight change of focus. Can you imagine? So that's penguin. So the point is, it's in these tiny little things that this old world is reified and substantiated and fights back. And we have to fight it, because otherwise, it's wrong. As Einstein says, it's a delusion. of consciousness, that we are separate. Maybe I'll read that now, if I can find it. Yeah. A human being is part of the whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical illusion of our consciousness. This delusion goes from illusion to delusion, is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of understanding and compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. And this is why we need imagination. Because if we can't imagine ourselves into a plant, a bird, and our animals, each other, Parsifal, have we asked the earth, what ails thee? Why is Gaia coming back to us? Why does this happen? When we have a dream and we can't understand it and it bowls us over, we are supposed to ask why, rather than carry on with breakfast. So here we haven't asked why. Why? What ails thee that thou art coming to us? That's what we should be saying. And then it's only too easy to answer, of course. But that it matters so much, that would suggest that this is a symbol of the world soul that is coming to us, asking us to recognize it and to wake up and to help it, her, come into being, that we are all necessary for this. And we can't just stand back and be a spectator, say it's the objective world, what can we do? Yes, well, you might well ask, but we can, because we know that we can in some places, and therefore we can in all places, and we can refuse the wrong language. And imagination never has oppositions in it. As Coleridge says, it's always seeking for wholes. Grant me a nature with two contrary forces, he says, the one which leads us into the infinite, that would be the original participation, and the other which struggles to find itself in this infinity. And I will cause a whole world of experiences to rise up before you, which will transform everything. So this next stage, we have to work out how, in what tiny little ways, we can bring our imagination to help us to feel into the lives of the world, in everything that we do, each tiny thing. And this is compassion. This is the momentous understanding of Parsifal. If we don't ask, we will never know. And indeed, in Parsifal, he only had to ask the question. Once he'd asked it, everything changed. And I think we could find the same. Now, Joseph Campbell says, what is the new mythology to be? The mythology of this unified earth as one harmonious being. So it's as though we're already waiting for a new mythology. We're already understanding that the old mythology, which probably wouldn't be called mythology, the old way of understanding the universe, the old gods and non-goddesses, shall we say, aren't helping the earth, and the earth is calling out to us. So if we go back now to Gaia, to why did Gaia come? What do we say? Now, in the beginning, the identity of human and cosmos was simply given. It could be experienced, but it couldn't be known. But in final participation, we can have a conscious choice. We've taken back some responsibilities, so we've expanded in consciousness, but what are we doing with it? Now it's a moral choice to Barfield, that we have to participate with the world and take responsibility for the world, directing our intellect to understand nature on nature's own terms. And this can only be achieved through imagination. There's just nothing else that will do it, because that is how we imagine new ways of being. And so we should go to the Romantic poets, as did Barfield. Coleridge, workers' suspension of disbelief for the moment. Leave room for the new, like the pupa leaves room for the chrysalis. Seeks the whole. Imagination brings the whole soul of man into activity. It reveals itself in the balance or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities. Imagination is the soul that is everywhere and in each, and forms all into one graceful and intelligent whole. And then there's Blake. To a man of imagination, nature is imagination itself. So if we find our imagination, I have a lovely picture for this, which I should have put on, there we are. There is the man of imagination, for whom nature is imagination itself. So if we imagine in wherever we can, in every area of life, and we feel from the perspective of those who are not us, from the world who one part of us does see as other, but the other part of us, the imaginative part of us, sees us both at a new level of the imagination as one sacred whole. And then that's the sense in which, going back to Yeats, this symbol, that Gaia could be a symbol of a new universe story, where the human soul and the soul of the world are reunited at a different level through the imagination, through this feeling for the whole. And then the world will change. And that may be why Gaia came to us through Lovelock and got taken off by the Geist of the time. So I could end with a quick poem. At least I'm ending. Okay, well, we can have a modern one or an ancient one. Which would we like? I'll do a modern one. O sweet, spontaneous earth, how often have the prurient fingers of doting philosophers pinched and poked thee? Has the naughty thumb of science prodded thy beauty? How often have religions taken thee upon their scraggy knees, squeezing and buffeting thee that thou mightest conceive gods? But, true to the incomparable couch of death thy rhythmic lover, thou answerest them only with spring.